back, chapter 9. Basically, moving on and getting through to the second component of week 3. So that's aggression relating to sport. So um, we talked a little bit about anxiety, we talked about arousal, we talked about stress today in class. So why not move on to the aggressive side in sport? So let's take a look through all of our stuff going on here. Um, so really, what is aggression? It is a behavior. It's, at this point, aggression is a behavior. It is not an emotion at that point, and it's the intention of a person to inflict pain or harm on another person. So basically, it's the act of. Unlike the next part, where we would see here, where it says it's not about negative thoughts, feelings of anger, or a desire to hurt somebody. It's actually the physical harm that is placed on a person, so that you can see the differences between the two. Physical act versus emotional expression is a good way to put it. One of the things that, ding ding, here you go, might be something that is put on your test is aggression may also be called proactive assertion. All right, so that may come up at some point as well. So moving into that, there it is up top here, proactive assertion, just making sure that we have that all squared away. So proactive assertion basically is an acceptable behavior that has force behind it. So if you look, in sport, we know that is contact in a majority of sports that are played. Hockey, football, basketball, even baseball has contact. But one of the a lot of the rule changes that came out with baseball, and this book being a little bit older that we work out of, there's a slight disconnect. So I am going to kind of show you some of the examples of that as we get through here. But proactive assertion, again, forceful. It's forceful behavior, but if it's acceptable, that means that it's within the rules of that game. So the intention is not there to create what we call malice, or that intentional harm. So looking here, what do we see? Football blocking. Well, of course you're gonna, it's an acceptable part of the game. A body check in ice hockey, it's an acceptable, it's acceptable part of the game. Now, if that check is used with the stick and you have a cross check, that's a whole different thing. It can be body on body. Okay. Overpowering your opponent when going up for a rebound. When you come up for a rebound and your elbows are out, if you're not aggressively swinging them around, well, then it's part of the game. But if your elbows are there and you happen to make contact with somebody, it's part of the game. It's not like you were intentionally doing it. And then here's where the tricky part comes in. The new rules in baseball, the last few years that have been played, is you used to be able to slide aggressively into the direction of the shortstop or second base for like a double play. So the second baseman or the shortstop cannot make the throw to first base as easy. Now, if you do that, what they do is it's automatic out, and you cannot make any advancement or anything like that. So if you intentionally go in that direction, that's one. Another one is making contact with the catcher. You can no longer do that as well. There still can be contact, but you used to be able to just, lower your shoulder, and it was basically a battle of the bronze at that point of whoever, took the hit. So a lot of that stuff in baseball kind of went away because unnecessary injuries were occurring for a sport that really doesn't require a lot of contact. So it makes a lot of sense. So when looking at characteristic-wise, again, we talk about it. It's not a feeling or emotion. It is a behavior, okay? And we talked about proactive assertion, being part of the game because the intention is not there to hurt somebody, all right? Aggression does reflect an intentional act. It does not happen by accident. It is something that is part of what you're doing. But it's an issue where, like it says here, the aggressor must desire or threaten to harm or injure the intended victim. That's when things occur. So when it becomes truly an intentional act, or you know what I mean? So that's what we're looking at there. Harm or injury must actually occur for aggression. So it's really kind of an interesting thing, but harm or injury. But then also, if you think about it, intimidation, embarrassment, and then deprivation, all of those things are kind of a different type of harm, not, but it's still there. So you'll see that the different levels of aggression will show what we're talking about there. Aggression must also involve another living being. Um, Hurting a person or an animal is aggression. Like it says, kicking a chair is not. So, if it's an object, if it's a towel or a ball, or, if you go in and if you get mad during a basketball game and you pick up the basketball and you kick that basketball, as far as you can, it's not, it wouldn't be necessarily aggression. But if you kick that basketball and that basketball took a wrong turn off the freeway, and ended up whacking some little kid in the face, then that might be a change in the characteristics of what really is aggression at that point. So, again, you have proactive assertion, which is acceptable behavior. So moving down, you go into instrumental aggression. Now, this is where those different levels come into play. One of the things is, with instrumental aggression, the goal here is to, basically, how do you kind of, you're kind of aiming to harm somebody, okay? Whether accidentally or not. So it's one of those things where instrumental aggression, I think, because it's not always the case, instrumental aggression, like for the accidental or non-accidental part, think about it from the perspective of instrumental aggression as intimidation, and intimidation being one of those processes that, although intimidation may not cause any harm, there actually could be a point in time where, although you weren't trying to, you do. All right. So, although it's not to like it says, although it's not to injure, the harm remains. That it could happen. So, the example they use, the very first one, is a really good one. In baseball or softball, you're going to throw the ball super inside to that batter, off of home plate, closer to the batter, to kind of intimidate them, to back them off of, maybe they hit a home run the last time, so you're going to pitch really close inside of them, kind of move them out of their area, and they're going to change where they are in the batter's box, and you can mess with them a little bit there. The difference with that, though, is that with instrumental aggression, in knowing what you're doing, you can act. If you hit the batter, understand it's part of that instrumental aggression. So it's part of the game. Now, if you were to take and throw a fastball up and in and aim for the person's head directly, well, then that's a whole different. That's going to come up in the next few slides about what that is. But this right here, it means that if you're trying to, intimidate the batter and they're standing really close inside of that batter's box and you hit them, hey, take your base. That's really kind of how it works. Okay. Now, this is where the actual intent to hurt or harm or injure is relevant. Hostile or reactive aggression. Okay. Intentionally hitting a batter. Yep. Like I said, throwing it directly at their head. There you go. A soccer player, that they're, intentionally tripping. Instead of trying to do a slide tackle correctly and try to steal the ball away, you're actually, sliding into trip them versus actually going for the ball. So it's just, or, a football player. No, not really a football player. A soccer player grabbing at the back of someone's jersey to throw them down to the field. That's hostile or reactive aggression. All right. So these are here. So if we go back, part of the game, proactive assertion, intimidation factor, instrumental aggression, on purpose, unnecessary, intent to harm, all there for hostile or reactive aggression. So pay attention to those. Definitely you might find them on your test. So, but, what really happens when it comes down to it? So if we're going to go back from the instrumental aggression part to the hostile part of it, so we look at everything from the instrumental aggression side. Look at here. If there is an issue where an injured player does get hurt, and obviously if it was meant for that purpose, usually a penalty is thrown. Like it says here, it's often met with a punitive measure. So that's usually the penalty that's there. It's one of those things that, kind of keeps everything from being, this is where the penalty component keeps everything from being just proactive assertion. So if it was proactive assertion that resulted in a penalty, then technically it is instrumental aggression because the harm was seen, the intent to harm was seen through the referee's eyes. So one of the things here I find is really interesting is, the next number 2 here, laboratory research findings indicate both male and female athletes react less aggressively to violent visual stimuli than non-athletes do. Because athletes are so in tune to the game, they don't see things in the same manner. They don't have that, that kill mentality. If something really fires them up, they actually have a way to channel that aggression. Not all the time, but if we talk about majority now remember, a lab research setting, it does not mean it has to be 100%, but what we're saying is that majority of the time you see that, and less aggressively. Well, that's a great thing to know, because it means your players aren't going to fly off the handle. Highly skilled athletes want to perceive their success as due to their ability, not because of injury or good luck. That goes back to that internal, external factoring that we talked about for last week. Although the video got screwy a little bit, that was on your test. The internal versus the external factors of ability, task, environment, or luck. So those are things that come into play there. But, that's really what it comes down to. You don't need to worry. It's not because someone got hurt. It's like, oh, the best player got hurt, that's why we won. No, we want to say that we were outskilled them. Now, typically, like a proactive assertion in some way, a legitimate act is just everything that's viewed as normal within a game. A hard slide in baseball, if a player is sliding in and a player steps in front of them, they get hit, it's part of the game. Football has really toned down those hard hits. There's a lot of penalties that are now thrown for, like defenseless receivers, where the player catches the ball in midair, and before they can even land, they're getting lit up midair. So those types of things have gone away, and that ability to really lay into a player, even though it's still there, it's really been taken back. So like those vicious hits that you see that are from, old reruns of everything, that doesn't really happen as much, but it's still, you can set your precedent. If you whack a player pretty good, then it's going to, you're setting the tone pretty quick. So what do we look at here? We have what's called the biological or instinct theories, is that, we know that from, let's see, if we go back to when cavemen were around, it's a natural behavior that we have this aggression. Animals have it, humans have it. It's just, we have this ingrained aggression that we have that is technically channeled out and sent through our, basically our synapses that require our brain to function, that says, nope, there's a dominance factor that needs to occur, and that aggression becomes there. So what ends up happening? Well, if the buildup occurs and aggression consumes you, then most likely you're going to react in a negative way. But what ends up happening also is that through aggression, if you can channel it in the right way, you can end up with a massively productive athlete or exerciser who can complete the task that's in front of them. All right. So when it's one of those things where, biologically we're meant to be aggressive and we're meant to take what's ours. And, in sport, we have rules that we have to follow. So if we become too aggressive, then ultimately it can really affect our teams. So some of the stuff, though, like it says here, some of the pros and cons, animals, including primates, they are, not everybody is territorial, but, obviously a lion is going to be way more territorial than a human. So, it's part of it. But understand that this is the pro con, conflict, is that, not everybody acts that way. But you know what? There is some of this, factoring that, if you come up in, and I like the example they use here, where you come up in like a criminal based home where, like, mom or dad was an aggressive person, and maybe kids realize that dad or mom was laying out people in the street because they just felt like fighting people. Then the kid can obviously develop those types of behaviors, and they can become that same way. It's like, you don't want to say criminals breed criminals, but in some way, if a child sees that in their upbringing, well, then they see that it's okay. they see that what they're doing is actually correct. So in some cases, upbringing really can play can play a havoc on it, especially if you come up from that environment. Now, that's not always the case, but there is some link. Okay. Then you have the catharsis hypothesis when you basically are there's this need to purge, and I know they have all these joking horrible dumb movies that you see. Some people like them, whatever, but basically they have this one day of the year where you can basically purge and do whatever you want to do, and basically by doing that purge, you're going to release all of that aggression and that anger and those hostilities that you feel, and basically it ends up being like this just one outburst that has to happen. It's like when you have that calm person who just takes it and takes it and takes it and takes it, and then one day they just blow up. It's like that's the catharsis hypothesis. Just it built up for so long that finally you have to have that release, and unfortunately, it just happens to come in that one blow. So it in some way, I mean, I do buy into that a little bit, but as long as you can find ways to help channel this aggressive behavior or use it correctly in the right manner outside in like a practice environment, not even practice, but like outside of practice, actually outside of team base where you can have athletes release tension and find some ways to do that, it can really be that way. So with the hydraulic model, prolonged frustration leads to anger. So basically, what ends up happening is that, in a closed environment, when you have all this pressure that builds up, it has to be released in some way. So basically what you're saying is that you have, what do we want to call it? Pent up aggression. Pent up aggression is something that occurs, but again, at some point there needs to be this release. But if you keep that release point hidden or it doesn't come out, then obviously there's this way that there's an increase in that anger, that frustration, that aggression that will and it can eventually build up to be something worse than it is. So that's what we're looking at here. So what we're saying with the frustration aggression part is, if you look at the first one, and kind of sums up everything here, but based on the concept that the frustration of not meeting goals and satisfying personal needs can make a person angry. And so because of that, that anger leads to aggressive behavior, and then from there, it's just a vicious cycle. Let's see. If you ever, let's not even go true sports. If you ever, went to a place and hung out and played darts, right? Or you went and played, how many of you have gone and played pool before? And you sit there and you try, or actually really the best one is mini golf. You have a simple, easy putt and you miss it. You go to the next one, simple, easy putt, you miss it. And, there's that frustration starting to build. So then what ends up happening is like 3 holes later, you end up taking taking the I-9 freeway where the ball's flying down, and it ends up taking a beeline outside of the gate of the of the mini golf course, because instead of using your putter correctly, you use it as a driver, and that ball ends up in someone's windshield. So it's really the buildup of frustration leads to the aggressive act. So again, finding ways to channel, finding ways to develop a way to evaluate somebody and see what it is that's triggering them to get so frustrated. But I do like this right here. What ends up happening, and really the highlighted component here, the frustrated athlete is more likely to attempt to injure the opponent when trying to obtain the possession of a ball. So it's one of those things where the athlete needs to understand, or the exerciser needs to understand, that as frustrated as they get, taking it out on the next person is not it's gonna lead to things that are way worse than what it could be. All right. So what is it that we talk about here in terms of this? We look at it that there's that connection between anger and aggression. The anger buildup, the anger that frustration leads to anger, which leads to the aggressive act. But really, what we're saying here is that without the presence of anger, the aggression may not come to fruition. All right. So what are we looking at here? Looking at social learning. Well, we know that social learning is really it's what you see in the environment that's around you. So a modeling effect. If you see a player as a kid, kids are notorious for this, especially teenagers. They're notorious for this, but or even like higher elementary school because they understand. But you get a basketball player who after he slam dunks a ball, he comes down and he makes some sort of gesture that's very aggressive, and then it doesn't matter who's in front of him, he tries running through him. Well, in the modeling effect, that behavior is modeled, and what you observe from that modeling as a kid, as an adult, whatever, you see that it's okay. So what are you going to do? You're going to model that behavior, and you're going to do the same thing. Well, guess what? You don't play in the NBA, and then you may not know the repercussions of what happened during that game. You might have just saw it in a highlight, so you didn't see that player ended up getting a technical foul and then got thrown out of the game. You know what I mean? So the modeling effect really means that what you see is what you're going to say is okay, and then you're going to basically do that similar behavior. Okay. So vicarious processes. So again, that kind of goes back to you hear through you're living vicariously through something else. So again, the example here is that a child who hears a crowd cheer after an athlete has injured an opponent. Well, what you're saying to that kid is, oh, okay, that's cool. That's all right that you can do that, because you're basically saying you're living vicariously through it. So after you live vicariously through the athlete, you get the aggressive behavior that's been caught by the attention of the fans, and therefore those observers are going to reward that behavior. So it's part of the process. But again, it's just gonna that trend will occur. So that kid sees it, and they see they hear it, and they hear the crowd cheering so that their assumption is that, oh, well, that's what we want, we need this to happen. So it's not necessarily the best thing, but again, these are all social learning cues. All right. We kind of hit on this today in our lecture from chapter 6, talking about stress, arousal, and anxiety. So here we talked about the inverted U, meaning that there is this optimal level of aggression, optimal level of arousal that can occur, and through that optimal level of arousal, you get the best performance out of your people. Now, we did say that there is a sliding scale, and we know that some people might need a little bit more arousal than the optimal level, and some might need a little bit less, but for the majority of us, it's in that direct center, so that's what we look at. Okay, so again, if you look at it here, if we look at the arousal part, then we also need to look at the level of aggressive part. So too little aggression, and you become, you become a, don't want to say wimp, but you basically become lacking in effort. So like they say, energy and speed. All right, too much aggression, and that's going to be misplaced, and it's going to be leading to a lack of focus. It's going to lead to a lack of concentration. It's going to lead to stupid penalties that shouldn't occur. So you have to find that middle ground that works, where you can be aggressive when you need to and laid back when you need to make sure that you don't make the mistakes that can cost your team. Okay, so really, it's one of those things where we have to understand, though, that aggression is really hard to have a direct measure to. So what do we have to look at? We have to look at athlete and exercise their behaviors, and then basically by getting them to kind of explain the chain of events and seeing what their interpretation is of everything that happened, we can kind of understand, like, okay, we can't do that again, or we need to channel it in this way, blah blah blah. Okay, so really, the other thing too is there's no clear-cut result or consensus about what really is an aggressive penalty. So I know you've all seen it because you watch sports, but when you watch sports, you see that one team might have gotten this call this way, and another team might have got another call that way, and it's like, well, how is the fairness factor playing into it at that point? And that's really what it comes down to. All right. So it's just, it's a really frustrating thing when it comes to sport, because things are so very subjective. All right. And then really, like it says here, performance quality versus performance outcomes, or performance success. We know that really performance is really a behavior that has a goal attached to it, and therefore what we look for is the outcome is the behavior. So what we're saying here is that performance quality, how well was something done versus the outcome or the success, where we know, like we said, outcome is a consequence. What is it that came from what you did? And the success is, did it lack success or was it, successful? All right. So really, what does it mean? Well, if we have the correct level of aggression, then ultimately our performance quality should be really good. And the outcomes or the successes, well, even if you had this correct level of aggressiveness, then what we're saying is that your level of performance was adequate or above. But it wasn't to the point where it was extreme, where things were going the wrong way. So you can see if it was in the reverse fashion, how penalties occur, you had a poor game, quality of performance was down, etc. Okay. So what are we looking at here? Assertive players, we know they're there. Okay, we know that assertive players are not going to be taken advantage of. We know that they're not going to be the ones that roll over and play dead. Assertive players respect the performance or respect the ability levels of the other players. One thing that does come up very common when you talk to elite level football players is, although they put it all out there during gameplay, and they may make hard hits and everything like that. Well, I mean, you see a lot of them shake hands after the game, everything like that. Boxers do it occasionally as well. But one of the things that they realize as football players, and they'll tell you this straight to your face, is there is never truly a moment where the intent to harm is so high, because what they understand is that each one of them is playing this sport for a living, and they know that if they were to get hurt by a player or if they were to hurt a player, ultimately you're taking away their livelihood. And very few of them, when you speak with them, really they understand that part of it and they respect that part, even though they do go out there and put it all out there. So, a personal safety issue comes into play there where they do get it. Okay. Assertive players are intense, they're confident, they're persistent. I mean, that's just part of what they know. They're constantly challenging themselves because they're trying to achieve something greater than just normal performance. And then, like it says here, aggressive action is motivated by hostile intentions. Okay, so aggressive action is motivated by hostile intentions. So what that means is that if the intent was there, then they're going to be aggressive to the point. But again, it's gonna be aggressive to the point of performance being at the right level. Okay, non-assertive. What are we saying here? Diminished performance. And that's really what it comes down to. But being assertive is something that's learned and practiced. It's not something that's just instilled. Now, you can have somebody who, understands it through upbringing, but it still has to be learned, especially when you play specific sports and everything like that. And then tolerating aggression. This is one of those things where, starting at a young age, kids definitely need to know the ins and outs, need to know the right and wrongs. They need to know what's aggressive, how to put aggression into some box and channel it. But they also need to have a level of control. They also have to have an understanding of what it is like to be stressed out or be in a really uncomfortable situation. And it's all cognitive ability at that point. And then what that leads to is, through tolerating aggression, you end up with a better control of anxiety, and you end up with a better level of self-esteem. So kids appreciate themselves a little bit more at that point. All right. Here you guys can read through these. I'm not going to go very deep into these, but you can read into them. Let's see, some things. Let's see. Yeah, coaches should state their expectations, number 3, of appropriate athlete behaviors at the first meeting. If you abuse the rule, there is going to be some sanctions. Referees and umpires they basically set the tone of the game, and they have to keep that tone. So if you're not going to take the crap that day, then you're not taking the crap that day. If you let things get a little bit out of hand, then the whole game gets out of hand, and it's awful. Other ones. Um, don't respond to negative or threatening quotes from opponents. Like, don't get psyched out by them, because all it's going to do is lead to, it's basically feeding into you're basically fueling their fire, because you're basically doing everything they want you to do, and they're psyching you out. Um, one of the things that, family members should be encouraged to attend, because it's going to reinforce what the coach tells you. Like if your mom uses that glaring look from the stands, you're going to have a complete meltdown and be like, nope, can't do that. Um, and then coaches can discourage violent behaviors by having a pregame talk. So, if you go into a hostile environment, kind of like when we talked about in class, where, when I was playing high school basketball and everything like that, you walk into that hostile environment, the coach got to be there to set the tone and pregame and get everybody back into the flow and not get super excited. So that can become a part of it. Um, one of the things that you probably will be asked on in your test is going to be something like this. Male versus female. All right. Both athlete and non-athlete males demonstrate more aggressive behavioral tendencies than female counterparts. Okay. That was back in 2002. So, uh, I can't, again, you can't say that that's 100% true. Okay. But females do not feel empathy. It says like the sexes can exhibit similar aggressive actions. If females do not feel empathy toward their opponents, females are not anxious about being aggressive, and an aggressive response appears justified. So just because males have that tendency to be a little bit more aggressive doesn't mean that females are just going to shy away from it. So, um, I personally think that there are a lot of females who get aggressive and use it to their advantage, because maybe they feel as though they can. Okay. Um, Whoops, I think I went the wrong way. So, and then again, male intercollegiate athletes felt more frustrated during competition than their female counterparts. Females are a little bit more rational, which I totally agree with, and males tend to fly off the handle a little bit more. Male athletes more than female athletes become more angered and wanting to injure an opponent more. It doesn't mean that females are, like, oh, poor baby kind of a thing, but it just means that, guys are quick to retaliate and to, when they become injured, when they become angered, they want to injure. Um, Males rated behaviors that violated rules and can injure opponents as more acceptable than females. Females, again, more rational. They are more likely to get less penalties because of that. Um, and then sports socialization may legitimize aggressive behavior that violates rules for males but not for females. So again, it, it's a one way of that part of it. So what are we saying about females? Female athletes scored higher than female non-athletes on aggression as a personality trait. Well, of course, they had that competition instilled in them. Of course, they're going to. And then female competitors contend that they would never purposely injure another player, and that goes back up to the part here where angered and want to injure. This part right here with males. All right. This is going to be a question that will never go away, but I don't think it will. Aggression is gonna. It's not. How can it go away? It's instilled in a competition level sport. I really don't feel like it's going to go anywhere. Um, I feel coaches and other players can get they treat everything in similar fashions, and it's just something that's carried on from generation to generation. All right, so what do we do with so when we talk about the mental part of it, what's anger going to do? Well, we have increased adrenaline flow, so you have a sympathetic reaction. You have an increase in a lot of physiological parameters, so it is normal. There is a fight or flight response to anger. Okay, and we know that. So we are programmed to feel anger. That's part of it. So what is it that we need to get out of this? What is the norm? Oh my God, the normality of anger. So we're looking. Anger cannot be controlled because emotions are passions which are uncontrollable. Now, again, these are what's normal. Anger cannot be controlled because emotions are passions which are uncontrollable. Well, yeah, I mean, if anger comes out, it's just how you deal with it and how you can diminish it quicker than letting it overcome you or consume you. Anger should not be controlled. that is something, if you keep things bottled up, it's only going to, it's just like shaking up a 2 liter bottle of Pepsi. Because at some point, if you unleash that thing's going to go. All right. And then the other factor is anger can be completely controlled and prevented. And that's really what it comes down to, is there are three fashions to it, but ultimately, it can be controlled, and that's really what it comes down to when it comes to your personality, how you perceive events, things like that. But it's one of those things where it's really more personality or trait based than anything else. So more people, most people who don't really have the anger issue, well, what are they doing that's different than somebody else that does? All right, and that's where you can kind of figure that out. Um, Anger reduces an athlete's ability to analyze information, strategize, and make really rapid decisions. Well, yeah, you kind of start losing that focus when you start getting a higher level of anger. Um, Anger keeps the athlete focused on unpleasant and distressing thoughts. Well, so again, not mentally in the game or in the exercise session or whatever it may be. It's just you're gone. Um, Angry outbursts lead to a prolonged negative mood state. Well, yeah, I mean, um, venting is not. Venting is one of those things. Like, well, they say venting hostility, but really, like when you vent, it's like it needs to be a calming mechanism more than it is about just venting to vent. Because if you vent and it keeps you angry, then it's not doing anything. All right. So, what do we got to do? Well, there's anger management strategies that we can work with. Decrease the amount of arousal. Find ways that you can do that, and there's, 5 different examples there. What you can do is cognitive self manipulation. Like what they say here is distract yourself. That's really one good way. And just kind of taking yourself out of it. And then humor. Some people do very well with humor and getting them to kind of take themselves out of that issue. And, it's just, oh, okay, well, I'm going to laugh it off. So those are just 2 ways that we can do it. But there is nothing wrong with either one of those. And it's really going to be a good move if you can, coach that out. And so what do we look at? Distraction hypothesis. What we say is that exercise can be a motivator to remove anger. All right. And that like it says here, physical fatigue makes it increasingly difficult to get those thoughts back to an angry status. Okay. So by fatiguing the system, you're basically fatiguing the ability to create a continuance of anger, which I definitely agree with, because we've talked about it in class before, where we've used it as a venting tool and a way to de-stress ourselves. Well, and that's the same thing. If we can de-stress ourselves, we can de-angerize ourselves, if you really want to use a non-existent word. All right. So, there are some behavioral approaches that we can look at it from. We already talked about it, but I mean, some of these things are a little bit like rehearsing the basis for anger. People talk about rehearsal, and trying to replay everything that happens. Crystallization of discontent. What we're saying here is viewing unpleasant or disappointing experiences over a period of time rather than isolation. So what you're doing is you're using it long term versus in that moment. Okay. And really, it's one of those things where if you use it in the moment, it's going to be used incorrectly. And you won't be able to get over it as easy. So. Channeling is a really good way. Channel it into a positive versus basically channeling is another word for redirection, and you're basically taking aggression and displacing it. So what do? Who do you take it out on? You take it on your opponent, not in that way, but you take it out on the opponent so that you can become better of a performer, and it's not getting to you. Overcoming unfairness. If you felt like you were slighted by a referee, well, you're going to channel it to then overcome that and do better. And then it says here, exercise and training more vigorously instead of hurting, offending, or injuring other people. So those are just ways of channeling. Justification, what they're saying here is, it's justified that you were angry is really what it comes down to. We've talked about road rage in class and everything like that, but basically when in road rage situations, you feel as though you're justified in becoming aggressive because of anger, and that it was okay to do a specific cutoff of somebody or throw somebody the bird or whatever it may be because it was warranted, so it was justified that you can act that way because you felt like you were slighted. Okay, so other things, expressing, constructively expressing anger. I do agree with this one here, using I, not you statements. Put it back on you as the person. Um, you need to address the behavior, not the personality, or you know, basically the makeup of the person who is technically offending you. All right, and then separate one's expression of anger from providing information. So, um, I don't agree with it, but if the anger comes out first with a coach or a trainer, um, it needs to be followed up with, but here's the deal. All right. Now, again, anger can turn off, especially younger athletes. It can really turn them off and not make them even listen to anything after that. So you got to be very careful with the environment and the status of the players that you have. All right. So just got to make sure you're aware of that. Now, one of the things that we also can have here is, spectators, and then creating violence, creating aggressive. So, it's a really tough thing because, when you ever talk to people about, I like this team, my brother is really big on this and he's really kind of funny about it. But, we talked about how he's a huge Patriots fan and he'll be like, yeah, we need to step up. And it's like, you know, again, that's embedding yourself into this whole I'm part of the team thing. Well, then if you feel as though you have that much invested, then ultimately you will react in certain ways depending upon that. So, um, you know, there's a lot of things that come with spectators. There's a lot of things that come with spectator violence, and there's really a lot of it that comes down to like the environment. Um, so what do we look at? There's predictions. There's pleasure derived from observing a team succeed. So then you'll have more positive feelings, and then you're going to have less negative feelings toward the other team because you're just say your team is crushing the other team. Well, yeah, you're going to feel elated, all right, and then one's enjoyment from observing a team lose should increase with negative feelings about the team and decrease with positive feelings. All right, so it's just those are things that we know, and I do agree with both of them. All right. But what happens with violence? The ding ding test potential question. Well, there's a lot of things that happen. Crowd incitement to intimidate opposing teams and officials. Um, you know, it's like it says. It's one of those things where yeah, you're trying to use that intimidation factor, and so therefore it gets overboard, and somebody always takes an offense to it, and then that's when things can go wrong. The availability of alcohol, if for the most part, there is a cutoff point between when you can, when alcohol can no longer be purchased at a game. All right. The later the game, the more tired people get, the more frustrated people get, the worse it can be for the violent component. Um, the offensive rallies, if you have a team that's coming from behind and all of a sudden they come back, well then the other people are going to be offended and things can happen. Warm weather, heat makes people insane. All right, inexpensive seats, there is some correlation that they have found that individuals who sit in the cheaper seats, or the nosebleed, whatever way you want to call it, there is some correlation between that and violent behaviors. If you look at, growing up where I did, you look at the old Yankee Stadium and you had the bleacher seats out in right field, and that's where you saw fights happen all the time. And it's like, well, they were the cheaper seats. So what they say is that if you don't, what they're saying is that without higher amounts of money being paid, the status of people can really change. So I mean, whatever, it is what it is. But that's what was seen, and I would never say it unless it was backed up by what I read. And so, and then if there's violence, like hockey games, a lot of times there's fights that happen on the ice. Well, that creates fights that happen in the stands. All right, so those are pretty good predictors at that point. Um, We know that crowd noise can, create aggression. It's just part of the process. The louder it gets, the more enthusiastic people get, the more people start peeling off at the seams. And then, although it seems like it is, I do agree with this Coakley from 1990 here saying that um, it's less common than we think, and I definitely agree with that. I mean, you don't hear about spectator violence happening all the time. It's not at every if it happened at every single game, you'd hear about it after every single game, and there'd be a problem. Okay, so that really becomes a thing. But really, contact sports are going to be the one. They're going to be the one that contributes to the highest level of violence. So it is what it is. And then they talk about ways that you can curb violence. It's going to be what it's going to be. I find some of this stuff kind of interesting. But number 6, ban parents from attending competitions. Well, if my dad got into a fight during a game, I would hope that they'd ban him because that just means it's going to lead to something else. But there's other things in here, not really to be tested upon, but just to go ahead and look at on your own. But some of it can be a little bit interesting, like start contests at a time to encourage earlier completion times. Well, that's only especially when you get to elite level, you can't dictate that. Local levels, it's a little bit more at that point. And then number 1 we talked about, reduce or eliminate alcohol availability. And then obviously security personnel, but that's only as good as it can be, because if you have, security personnel that are just there to collect the paycheck, well, then they're not going to put themselves in harm's way. I mean, if they don't feel as though it's worthy of it. So just, part of the process. So that's the end of this chapter. So there will be another video for chapter 7 because we do skip chapter 8 this week. So again, going back to aggression in sport, a little bit longer but again, 36 slides. Kind of got to get through them. Just take a listen to this. I promise you, my headphones are working now because I clicked the right button, so you should hear some sound to this. All right. So have a great night and hear from you soon.